Good afternoon, everyone, on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. I'd like to start out today's presentation with a story. Now, today we're talking all about how to determine if working from home is working for you. I had a very good friend who was in a senior role at Johnson & Johnson in marketing. She worked for J&J for over 20 years. Now, as many of you know, as big companies tend to do, there came a point when Johnson & Johnson decided to consolidate and move a lot of their offices that used to be in California back to the East Coast. She decided that she wanted to stay in the Bay Area. She loved it here. She'd built her life here. She had her friends. She had her network here. And she wasn't willing to move back to the East Coast for her career and was able to continue to find remote roles where she was still able to build her skill set, move up in her career to an extent, and still remain remote, living in the city that she loved. Now, she was one of the rare examples of people that J&J allowed to do this because she had a very long and successful run with the company. Over time, she started to lose the connection she had to the home office as more and more people went back to the East Coast, built stronger relationships when they were in person. And she ended up having to take a remote role that she wasn't very excited about, but it enabled her to stay with J&J and get all the great benefits that you build up over years, including a pension, as well as stay in the city that she loved. This role ended up putting her under a boss that she did not get along with. It ended up getting really nasty. I'm not going to go into the details, but it was just not a good fit. And it was overall just a really terrible experience for her. So after a really long time with a company that she had devoted so much of her heart and soul to, she decided to leave and now works for a rather large tech company. But her story really illustrates one of the downfalls that can come from remaining in a remote capacity, particularly when other people in your office stay working in the office. You start to remove the opportunity for exposure, for increased networking, and to stay on top of people's minds as they start to think about promotional opportunities. Now, I'm pointing out one of the downfalls, but there are a lot of upsides to working remotely, right? So for example, you have flexibility. You can hang out all day in your yoga pants and nobody can see your yoga pants or your slippers, or like I'm wearing right now, flip-flops. You get rid of a commute, you get back all of that time, you have more control over who walks into your space, and arguably over who puts time on your calendar. So there's so much to be said for being in a remote capacity. What I'd like to highlight for you during this presentation is, number one, how do you determine where you would be most productive and happy? Number two, if you do decide to stay in a remote capacity, what do you need to be thinking about or compensate for so it doesn't put you at a disadvantage as you look to advance in your career? And number three, as you think about interviewing and the preference that you've decided that you have, whether it be in office or remote, what are some of the things that you should think about as you look for a role where you can be remote? So how do you determine where you would be most productive and happy, whether this be working from your home or working in the office, or perhaps a hybrid, which many of us have fallen into lately? There's an argument to be made that there is a pretty clear line for introverts. A lot of introverts like to work from home. They like to recharge when they're alone, and when you're in the office and interacting all day with lots of people, it zaps their energy. So we see a lot of introverts choose and have a strong preference of working from home. With extroverts, it tends to be a little bit more divided. But what's important to think about is, where do you like to be to feel the most inspired and motivated? Is that home alone with your thoughts, being able to interact via video with your coworkers? Or is that in an office when you're feeling the energy of people around you, able to hop into offices, quickly ask questions and get quick answers? Where is it that you tend to be most inspired and motivated? And if it is at home, how inspired and motivated do you feel in your home office? Second, how productive are you? So really think about this. Ask yourself this really serious question. Am I more productive in the office or am I more productive at home? Now, this answer is going to be different for everybody. If you do decide to work from home, are you able to maintain the boundaries between work and life? Is that working for you? Are you still able to enjoy your home space, even though you've got the temptation of working every time that you're there? Does that work in your favor? In terms of feedback that you've gotten, we've now had this sort of forced 18-month experiment where we, almost all of us who were in essential workers, have been working from home. So how has the feedback that you've gotten changed? Are you still on track? Are you still getting positive performance reviews? Have things changed for you? Are you still able to perform at the level that you were when you're remote versus when you were in office? Also, is being remote helping your career or is it hurting your career? How much have you been able to grow and get promoted over the past 18 months or so? I'll say a lot of the studies are suggesting that the ideal mix is spending 1 to 2 days in the office a week. So you can check some of the boxes that being in the office allow you to check. Keep your career on track, but then also get some of your flexibility and personal time, and decrease the commute by staying at home the rest of the days of the week. So these are all things to think about in terms of, which one of these setups is best for you. If you do decide that you want to remain a remote worker, now, if everybody else in your office has remained a remote worker, then we've got an even playing field. If you have decided to remain remote or mostly remote, and you've got other folks in your office who have decided to go back in person, there are some deficiencies or disadvantages that you'll want to think about and compensate for. I'm going to share a story with you. In my last marketing role, before I decided to become a coach, I was in a senior marketing position, working supporting 3 different sales teams that had very different agendas. And I was the sole marketing person doing that. I was also the sole marketing person who was working remotely. I was working long hours. I was traveling about 40% of the time. I had a boss who would frequently cancel our one-on-ones when I needed her input and check-ins to move things forward. There also was just not a great match between us from a personality standpoint. And so there were often times that I felt like I was working the hardest that I'd ever worked, but I was very unsupported. Now, that alone didn't help, the fact that my boss and I didn't have a great relationship, but also the fact that I was remote was a disadvantage. Now, the way that I was able to overcome that is that I flew back to the home office once or twice a week, and I spent once or twice a month, and I spent an extended time there. Now, I really tried to coincide these trips with offsites where the whole marketing team was getting together with the goal of building interpersonal relationships. Because what I've known for a long, long time now, and particularly now that I'm a coach and tap into people's motivations, is that people are promoted and people are placed on important projects. Yes, you have to have the skill set, but beyond that, we make decisions based on emotion. We make decisions to place people into different positions because we like them and we can relate to them and we think they're going to be easy to work with. So personal relationships matter so much in business and beyond. One particular instance, when I flew back, we had an offsite and I had some personal time with my VP, and he knew that I didn't have a great relationship with my boss. And I was able to highlight in a candid yet professional way after a couple of beers some of the difficulties that we'd been having and how this was impacting my ability to perform. What I didn't know is that conversation then put the wheels in motion for him to move me to another team that I liked better, work that I liked doing even more, working for a new boss who was super motivating and inspiring, and we got along really well. So if you are in a remote role, make a concerted effort to connect with the decision makers. This can be via going to the office from time to time and scheduling lunch, getting on special projects that you know that they're on so you can establish that FaceTime and build that relationship. Create time and space where not only are you visible to these decision makers, but they know and understand your value without having to rely on somebody else to tell them about it. And also find ways to form personal connections with them by sharing personal stories. Because again, people like to promote people that they like and that they can relate to. So that does matter. So think about that if you're in a remote capacity, how to connect with the decision makers who are in the office, so you don't end up in a position where they forget about you, because the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. That is a real thing. In addition, when you're remote, you want to make sure that you're having frequent conversations with your boss about your performance. How are you being perceived? Are you hitting the mark? Are you exceeding the mark? Are you not exceeding the mark? Are you underperforming? Make sure you're crystal clear about how you're perceived by the organization so that you can course correct if needed. Also, be sure that you're having frequent conversations about career trajectory so that you don't get forgotten as a remote employee. I want this and I want to be there by this time. What is it going to take for me to get there? Now, a lot of that depends on the amount of work you put in terms of clarity as to what would be a fulfilling path forward for you. To help you understand what that would be and ladder it up to your strengths so you're thriving in work and meeting your full potential. If you haven't had a chance to really think about that and dedicate some time, that's a great opportunity to work with a coach to really define what it is that you want to do next in your career so you can have those very targeted conversations that get you there faster. Third, how do you approach an interview when the working conditions are unclear, but you know you want to stay remote? I was recently, one more thing I wanted to cover before I transition to that third topic, onboarding and a remote capacity. This is something that we've been kind of experimenting with lately over the last 18 months. And for a lot of companies, this has been a huge pain source because we don't have ways to remote employees in a remote capacity, and it can leave new people at a huge disadvantage. So if you are starting at a new company and you're remote, you're gonna have to be proactive. And that means setting up one-on-ones with every single person who is instrumental to you getting your job done and forming those connections, warming up those relationships. And so that as you go to start asking for things to get done that impact your workflow, those people know you, they're comfortable with you, and it makes those conversations easier. In addition, when you have those one-on-ones, ask people, hey, what are the resources available that I can access to help me get up to speed quickly? You want to learn about the product, you want to learn about the industry, particularly if it's new to you, and make sure you don't fall flat. I did have a friend who started at Facebook during the pandemic, and in a remote capacity, she was actually transitioning from healthcare. So it was her first time working in tech, so huge learning curve already. Tack on the fact that she was remote, and it was a really hard transition to make because she didn't have the support and the resources to help her get up to speed quickly. She was surprised by a less than ideal performance review that she got about 9 months into her role that had caught her off guard. Frankly, she didn't know that she was underperforming. And as she started to think about it, it became really clear that she didn't have the support that she needed to learn as fast as she could to get up to speed. And already it was a sharp learning curve. Throw in the fact that she was starting at Facebook remote, and there weren't those facilities in place to help her get up to speed because we're all trying to figure out how to operate in a remote environment on the fly. And it left her at a disadvantage. So try to get ahead of that and ask as many questions as you can to get access to those resources so that you can onboard in a remote capacity and be successful. Finally, how do you approach an interview when the working conditions are unclear, but you know you want to stay remote? I have a really good recruiter friend who told me that she was working to fill a VP role, and they had 3 candidates who went all the way to the final round. All 3 candidates throughout the interview process had said, yeah, the company was very clear that, hey, you needed to be in office for this role. And all 3 of the candidates said, yeah, no problem, I can be in office. All 3 of the candidates, when they got to the offer stage, said, actually, I want to work remote. And companies, like people, have very strong opinions about what does work and what doesn't work. This particular company had decided, hey, we want our people in the office. And so the fact that those candidates weren't clear up front, even though the company was, meant that everybody wasted a lot of time going through that interview process when there was not a position available that they were actually looking for. And the company was interviewing candidates that wouldn't have worked out because they weren't willing to come into the office. So be super, super clear in the beginning of the interview. We know, hopefully, to be really clear about your salary expectations and make sure that what your value is can be met before you get too far into the interview process. That's just a really transparent conversation that's normal to have in the beginning. As you get further along in your career, I wouldn't advise that earlier in your career, but certainly as you get into these more senior levels. In addition, now what's different about us operating in this new current post-pandemic stage is you want to be super clear about what your expectations are for whether you want to work remotely or you want to work in person, or if you're open to hybrid. If your preference and the company's preference isn't a match to begin with, it's going to be a waste of everybody's time. And the interview process is already such a process that can drain us energetically and take up a lot of time, that you don't want to set yourself up for a situation where you're investing in something that's just not going to meet your needs or meet their needs. So be really clear up front about what your expectations are, and make sure that when you're interviewing for roles that are going to allow you to remain remote, be hybrid, or be in the office. That's everything that I have for you today. I hope that you got something helpful and useful out of this. If anybody's got any questions, I will leave just a few seconds at the end here to invite any and all questions to come in. Would love to hear what you guys are thinking, what you're struggling with, where you're landing, what shoes you're wearing. If you've got any questions, please ask. And I don't see anything coming in, so I'm going to bid you all a great day, and I hope this was useful. If you've got any more questions or want to explore what it's like to work with an executive career leadership coach, you can visit my website, swim-against.com, swim against the current.